the types of cases that we've been focused on are FEMA appeals, homeowner insurance disputes. A lot of it is navigation of how do I get these funds that I think, there's some sort of bureaucratic hurdle that folks need. We've had not a ton, but some eviction from FEMA trailers cases that I'll discuss briefly in a minute. And then Renew NC is kind of the new wave that I'll get into more. And of course, as Katie alluded to, it's rare that somebody walks in through our front door with one legal issue and you could just isolate that one. So it's just been a collaborative process across programs. People come in, obviously the disaster may have created a housing problem, but it also may have exacerbated a housing problem. You may have a conditions issue or an eviction because you lost your job, could have created or exacerbated domestic violence issues, and of course, consumer disputes and debt come up. So we've continued to try to work across programs to meet needs and meet people where they are. So a couple of not as fun slides, but I do want to put these in when I'm talking with partner organizations, because I know that it's the hardest part of all of our jobs here at PLS, but I'm sure for a lot of people on the phone, is we have limitations. We all have limitations, and they come from a bunch of different sources. And the worst thing in the world is to tell somebody that that's not an issue that I can help with when you really, really want to. But and it's hard to refer people as partner organizations and then have them say, I was told, couldn't help, but unfortunately that happens sometimes. So I just want to briefly name that and acknowledge it and know that it's a hard part of our job, but it's a hard part of your job, and it's hard on the folks who are applying for services. Because we do encourage everybody to apply because they don't know what we're able to take, and it changes over time. It obviously changed a year and a half ago after Helene, the case types that we take, that you might have called on September 25th and been told that we don't do that. But if you called on October 2nd, you're told that we do. We're in that same process right now. All programs are constantly making those kind of decisions to see what our priority areas should be. Okay, so now into the substance of the topical areas of law. Obviously, FEMA has been a big one over the course of the 15, 16 months since the storm. We had a little bit of a expected lull over the holiday season, but we've seen an influx of applicants for FEMA appeals in the first few weeks of this month. We do still see significant awards. It can be a little bit random. I know there's been a worry for the entire time, completely legitimate worry that, hey, FEMA funds are going to be cut off at X date, or certainly there have been layoffs at FEMA, and so there are some staff shortages, which makes the unpredictableness of it even more dramatic. But people do still see FEMA awards, and we think it's still worthwhile to do FEMA appeals, to send people to us who haven't gotten the assistance that they think that they deserve, or that you identify that they may deserve, because we are happy to still take those cases. Obviously, everybody here knows that those FEMA letters are somewhat ridiculous. I always say, like 98% of the people who work for FEMA, their hearts are in the right place. They're trying to do the right thing. They're constrained the same way everybody else is constrained, particularly in a large bureaucracy. Why would you go and work for the disaster response agency if you didn't want to help people in the wake of a disaster? But the letters are frustrating, and people are very reasonably frustrated by the fact that they will ask for a form of assistance, say home repair, and then get a letter back saying you're not eligible for child care, or send me the receipt for your chainsaw. These folks have been through the worst imaginable situation. They're just trying to fix the leak in their roof. They didn't ask for a chainsaw. They don't have kids, and they're getting these random letters, and people get understandably frustrated, and they should get understandably frustrated. We've obviously developed some expertise in interpreting those letters, discarding the nonsense ones that shouldn't even be responded to, but figuring out what they actually are asking for, trying to interpret what kind of supporting documentation is needed to change a decision, what kind of steps people should take. And when we feel the amount or type of assistance is incorrect, we can work with somebody to submit a declaration and that supporting documentation, usually in a nice little bundle. So instead of, people will get these requests and then they'll submit what FEMA asked for on October 1st, and then they'll submit what they asked for on October 5th. And then if you look at the FEMA portal, it's a bunch of different PDFs and God knows what letter they relate to. And so we try to make it a little bit easier for FEMA by putting it in like a packet where it's like, here's this, here's this, here's this. That's everything you asked for. Please give me this. So having said that, obviously, if somebody comes and applies for our services and we look at it and we think they're not eligible for more assistance, we never promise that we'll file an appeal. I would say the vast majority of people who come to us, we do end up filing an appeal, but sometimes folks have gotten what they're eligible for, or there's some sort of barrier that really is insurmountable. We will always investigate and analyze a case that we accept. And as I said, most of the time, people have something that is potentially left on the table. Whether they get it or not is a different story, but it's often worth at least trying. Obviously, many of the people on this call, along with us, have taken a crash course in the various types of FEMA assistance, so I won't belabor it. Some of it is, there's the 750 that was kind of all over the news at the beginning, the home repair. I'll touch on a couple of these other ones. It's often the case that displacement, I don't have on a later slide, but that's often we file an appeal for that because that's the kind of flat 3514 in this region that if you were displaced by your home, it was supposed to be the gap between rental assistance and hotel vouchers and the onset of the storm. A lot of people who were displaced from their home didn't end up getting that. So we see a lot of those awards, and that's significant money for folks who are trying to get back on their feet. Some of the rest of it is pretty obvious. We see so few awards for moving and storage and medical, dental. Happily, we don't see a lot for funeral or childcare. Rental assistance, I'll discuss later. And then accessibility is on there because, in theory, FEMA can make improvements to your house if you have a need for accessibility features because you're disabled or elderly, you need a ramp or whatever the case may be. Not sure how that works in practice, but it's always worth throwing in an appeal. Okay, so it's basically not worth people's time to apply for FEMA at this point if they haven't applied, because there was some squishiness on the deadline. Well, the deadline kept on getting moved back. And then even when it didn't get moved back, there was some squishiness for a little while afterwards. We're way past that. So that's just unfortunately past deadline. The letters say that folks have 60 days to appeal. This was obviously a source of great consternation to those of us in the organization last January or so, because we were getting such a huge influx of these appeals, and it would be like 5 days to appeal. This person has 4, this person has 3, this person has 6. We're not going to meet these deadlines. So obviously, big worry. Legal professionals tend to live in fear of deadlines. So happily, though, it's a good idea to meet the appeal deadline if you can, but it is not generally enforced. And the reason why I have this on here is if you come across somebody who says, hey, look, I missed my FEMA appeal deadline, so that's why I don't want to call PLS and try to get assistance. I'm perfectly comfortable with you telling them no call because that 60-day deadline is not generally enforced. FEMA changes all the time, so I can't promise anything, but we would not say you missed your deadline, too bad, so sad. The vast majority of our awards, I mean, this would be a hard thing for me to pull and not worth my time, but I would say 80% at least of our appeal awards were ones where they missed their deadline. However, this next deadline is more worrisome to me because we've heard enough chatter by now that we are operating under the general assumption that there's an appeal filing deadline by March 26th. In typical FEMA fashion, we've heard March 26th, March 27th, March 29th. So obviously we're picking March 26th, but that is annoying to hear a bunch of different ones. We are not going to stop taking those appeals on March 27th because FEMA's squishiness in the past, I want to see denials because somebody missed their deadline before we stop helping people with that. But we've heard a lot at this point. It sounds like that may be a real deadline. So we're operating under that assumption, and we would like the folks on the call to operate under that assumption. And that means anybody who wants a FEMA appeal, help from PLS, we do have a lot of people calling about it. If somebody calls on, March 21st, it's not really realistic to get it in by March 26th. So that's all. Please don't tell them not to call on March 21st, but encourage people to call as soon as possible. Okay, so I will whip through these denials, but we see a lot of issues with just, hey, there's something missing from the file documentation. It was hard for the applicant to prove their occupancy or ownership, or they have an address issue. And then sometimes there's just a mistake out there. So ownership, occupancy, address is something that kind of snuck up on FEMA out here in Western North Carolina because there are a lot of country roads and mountain roads. And you had, the old numbered state road got changed to a named road, but a lot of the documentation has the old number on it. But if you Google map it, it's the named road. There are all kinds of complications like that. And I would say that's the most common thing that we see that we can sort out. Because it is possible to do, and FEMA has a little bit of wiggle room on that. So won't get into all of it, but if somebody has had trouble verifying that, but they're like, I live there, I own it, that's my address, but we can help with those kind of issues. The other thing, we all got tripped up by that initial application. It's like a lot of people clicked they didn't have home damage because it wasn't that severe, or because they were a renter, so they were like, well, it's not my home. But then they got thrown into a non-assistance bucket by FEMA because it's kind of, again, it works through a formula. That doesn't matter. We can try to fix that with an appeal. People often say like, oh, I made a mistake. I didn't appeal for X, Y, or Z. Also doesn't matter. You can appeal for things that you didn't, apply for. So as long as you got an application in, we're happy to appeal for whatever issues exist. Obviously, one of the kind of glitchy things in the FEMA system is that you're relying on third parties, these third-party contractor inspectors who can sometimes be hard to get a hold of or coordinate with. Sometimes folks call like your insurance company, and the insurance company is like, I'm not going to return that phone call. That's not a core part of our business. So we see denials because of missed phone calls to third parties that the applicant has no control over, and we can try to sort that out. People have trouble getting estimates or documentation of repairs they made. Sometimes FEMA is confused because they say you have homeowners insurance, but it wasn't flood insurance, so I didn't get any money because it was a flood. So we can help with those kind of issues also. And that's not an exhaustive list. Obviously, everybody on this call is probably aware that roads and bridges were a particularly big issue here in Western North Carolina that FEMA wasn't totally equipped to deal with because it's more common here that those are privately owned than other places where these types of weather events are more common. We see a lot of awards for roads and bridges, but there are weird hoops that you have to jump through. It's worth appealing those cases. So if you still have folks out there who've kind of given up on that, there are some kind of tricks, and like just FEMA's a box ticking organization, like a lot of government bureaucracies have to be. So it's not really a criticism. But we've learned a lot, and so we'd be happy to take those cases. As with hazard mitigation, I had a client a couple of weeks ago who got the maximum, the 42,500 for a hazard mitigation. So what I mean by that is like the landslide hasn't happened yet, but it's about to happen, and they need a retaining wall and landscaping work and all kinds of engineering work to mitigate that potential hazard. That is a form of assistance that is technically available. It's hard to get. I had a colleague who was the first one to get one of these awards for her client, and she had an engineering report. So I followed that same thing and had an engineering report. So there are, again, box ticking things to do. So it can be a little bit tricky, but we do see some success with that. Rental assistance is unfortunately running out at the end of March, but I have that on there because we will file appeals for back rental assistance if people have that issue. And I have had people get significant awards in back rental assistance. Obviously, as with all of these issues, we can't promise anything. But I don't want people to be like, well, I didn't get 6 months last year, but I got it through March. so it's not worth appealing. Because I think it's worth appealing for the 6 months that you didn't get because they just, didn't process your application in time. So again, no promises, but happy to take a look at those cases. And then there are people like, I have no idea. My application's just stuck. I haven't heard from them in a year. And again, we'd be happy to look into that. We have learned useful information over the course of the past year and a half that at least gives there's no key to the kingdom, but we have some knowledge base and a bunch of people who've worked on these cases that can share information and try to figure out what's going on.
Max,
yeah.
Before you go to the next slide, I just realized I'd missed a question. What is the typical range of dollar amounts awarded for displacement?
So displacement assistance really, it's always $35.14, $3,514. That because it's just it's a formula, and it's only meant to be like a couple weeks of being displaced from your house, and then you're supposed to get hotel vouchers or rental assistance, obviously, in theory, since lots of people don't get those things. But displacement is just a flat number. But that, that's it's not a small flat number. So I think it's a good thing to appeal. So the people who have been staying in FEMA trailers, those expire at the end of March. There's nothing to be done to that. We have had a handful of folks who have come to us because they were being evicted prior to the deadline. We can help people with that. Obviously, that's a limited window when that will happen because, they're allowed to be evicted after March 29th. But people shouldn't get evicted in February from something that they were supposed to have through March, because how do you plan for that? You're piecing your life together. You're getting a job. You're getting your kids resettled. So we will take those cases if you have FEMA eviction situations, obviously with the caveat of eligibility. A lot of folks have the option to purchase those trailers for various amounts of money, but the common one is $5,500. That's hard money to come up with, but actually it goes to the question about displacement. $35.14 for somebody in a FEMA trailer is, a good chunk of the way towards the $5,500, which is why we encourage people to try to access funds from wherever they can. That is an option for people as long as they're able to put the trailer somewhere, hopefully where it is, depending on who owns the lot and whether they're open to that. I do want to flag this issue that we're talking about this week, and I know it was brought to Katie. If folks, it is kind of a narrow band of people, but if folks are potentially eligible for Renew NC, there's some troubling indication that purchasing a FEMA trailer may interfere with their eligibility for Renew NC. So because then they don't have an unmet housing need is the theory, which is crazy. And I hope that doesn't end up being the policy, especially people who had no idea that was their, either, they had to pick one option or the other. If you don't know that, it seems unfair. But if people I'll get into Renew NC in a second, but people are looking at the Renew NC process, we'd be happy to take a look at those cases, but I just wanted to throw that out there. So these are people have all kinds of questions about how they're able to use the funds, when to send back money to FEMA, when not to, what's a double recovery, am I eligible, particularly for undocumented folks. You get letters about you have to carry flood insurance. These are all legal questions that I would really encourage folks to send our way. They're usually kind of advice questions, but they're dependent on individual circumstances. So I'm not going to sit here on the side and give an answer to these questions, because I think that would be irresponsible, because they're fact dependent, but there usually is good advice to give folks. So if people have those kind of questions, we can, send them to, brief advice kind of situations, because I've taken a number of those cases off our application list over the course of the last 6 months, just to kind of have a day where I make phone calls to people to give them guidance on those types of issues.
I'm going to stop for just a second. There's a couple of questions in the chat. One of them is hazard mitigation assistance only available to primary homeowners.
The FEMA hazard mitigation will have the same eligibility requirements as home repair, which is that you owned and lived in the property. Okay, so homeowners insurance is a smaller part of our practice, but it's been a significant one for the since the storm. So homeowners insurance claims related to lien. We see plenty of causation denials. Unfortunately, a lot of people were denied because of causation. That's because it was a flood and they didn't have flood insurance. That's like tragic and unfair. Those are hard to do anything about. Sometimes do have cases that are the reverse, of course, because insurance companies are insurance companies. So they say you had flood insurance, so it wasn't a flood. Those are even more irritating. We will look at all these cases. Sometimes there's no solution, but for eligible folks, we can look at it. That people get partially denied, then people end up with very low offers for extensive repairs. And we see a surprising number of cases where people are just stuck. It's like, I thought I got $12,000, but I don't know who to call to get this $12,000 because they don't make it easy for you to get your $12,000. So that's very frustrating, but those we can usually shake loose the money because it's just somebody being, oh, you didn't sign this form, sorry, which is outrageous, but it happens. And insurance is just confusing to people. There are lots of hoops to jump through. It's hard to get your full policy from an insurance company, which sounds outrageous, but if you ask for it, they'll send you the recent declarations. You don't know who to contact. You don't know when you can make repairs. There's a lot of jargon like actual cash value and replacement value, the different types of coverages and exclusions, the documentation you need for the home repairs or the additional living expenses. So it's a morass for people. So we can help with some of those issues. People have various options in insurance cases. Sometimes, well, you can always negotiate. Sometimes you can appeal. There's sometimes an appraisal option, which is to get a third-party appraiser out there. We have done one mediation session who has an arbitrator who doesn't have authority to force settlement of a case, but can facilitate that. We did end up settling the case that way. PLS is not able to do insurance litigation, though. We just don't have the capacity or the time or the staff or anything like that. So unfortunately, people who have to do that will end up having to kind of pass them off to other people who hopefully would work on a contingency basis of some sort. But we encourage people to call us and see what we can do, because sometimes you can get through the hurdles. Okay, so Renew NC is the joint state federal repair and or rebuild program. This is coming up on us very fast, particularly with the weather event coming up in the middle, but the deadline to apply is next Saturday, January 31st. If folks own their home at the time of the storm and it served as their primary residence, we really encourage people to apply, even if they don't know. If they know for sure that they're not interested, obviously don't bother. But if they think they may want it, or maybe it's a backup to something else they're hoping to come through, get an application in. You don't have to submit all the documents at the application stage. It really is, if you use the phone number, which is 888-791-0207, it's probably a 15 to 20-minute conversation. Then you have an application in by the deadline. And then you don't have to follow up right away. They'll assign you a case manager and they'll ask for documents. You don't have to submit your documents at the application stage. You're not making a commitment at the application stage. So if people are even potentially interested in that, if something else falls through and they're even arguably eligible, we are encouraging people to get in an application by the deadline. And so we are anticipating a demand, and we will have significant capacity to help people with the aftermath of the application process, because obviously that's been a focus for us the past couple months, but that's coming to a pretty quick halt next weekend. So it is a contract. It's a repair contract. There are obligations. It's not the worst obligations in the world, but there is a stop work order. You don't have control over who the contractor is. You are saying that it'll be your primary residence for 3 years absent, a pretty big deal like a health event or something, like a serious need to move away. And even then, there's a little bit of risk involved. It's also a forgivable loan, which is great because that comes pretty darn close to being a grant. But It's not technically a grant because if you violate some of the contractual obligations, perhaps it converts to a loan. So we would like to help people understand these obligations, understand what they have to do. And then the second main bullet point on there is that there's some room to negotiate. Like, I don't like your floor plan. I don't like the size of the house. I don't like your determination that you get my $12,000 that I got from FEMA because it's a duplication of benefits. And we can try to assist people with negotiating with Renew NC when they've been approved but don't like the terms of the approval. And if you get denied, you do have an appeal right, and we can potentially, again, we don't promise that we would do one if it's not meritorious, but we can help assess and investigate and file appeals as warranted. And then where it gets complicated is, and I'm sure everybody on the call has seen this, but this interacts with a bunch of other legal issues because tons of our clients have some sort of murky ownership because the property has been passed down through generations. And so there are a lot of heirs, but one person lives there. So they're but the estates were never probated. So maybe your cousin in Texas owns part of the property and your cousin in Oregon owns part of the property. And how do you get Renew NC to accept that you are an owner? We are limited in our ability to litigate a probate case, but we can try to dig into these kind of cases and figure out what next steps are. And sometimes, hopefully, knock on wood, the solution will be relatively straightforward. Often it won't, unfortunately, but we can try to guide people and do our best to try to sort through those issues. And same goes for records issues. Like, my mom passed 15 years ago, but she's the one on the deed. Sometimes we don't do real estate transactions in-house at PLS, and people wouldn't want us to. We're not experts on that. We don't hire real estate transactional lawyers, but we can, again, guide people what they need. Sometimes get help from some of our lawyer partners in the community. And lastly, manufactured homes, sometimes the ownership is a little bit murky because they can be titled through the DMV, or if affixed to land and the application was filled out, sometimes then they convert to real property. So we can try to work through some of those issues. There are a lot of people with property issues. As I said, we're not real estate lawyers, so often we're not in a great position to help people with property disputes, but I always encourage people to apply to see how we may be able to help or give resources or point them in the right directions. And sometimes in relatively simple property cases, we can help. And yeah, I have a client who's got 111 from their insurance company, and then so it turned into it's the mortgage lender who won't give them the money as they rebuild the house. So you have all these intersecting issues. And so again, I don't want people to opt out because they think we can't help, because some of these issues we can, many of them we can, and almost always we can give some resources. Obviously, the debris issues continue to be a problem for people. We hear about that a lot at clinics. So it kind of depends on the nature of the issue, but sometimes we can give some guidance as to how to go about. Yeah, and then obviously everybody at PLS has been doing disaster recovery the entire time because, imagine the impact on our housing team by Helene. And people's income, people lost their jobs, the housing stock was decimated. So these are all kind of intersecting issues. Conditions cases obviously went through the roof with mold, and it leads to homeowners with foreclosure issues because they fell behind on their mortgage, and people getting evicted because they lost their service industry job because the restaurant shut down, and people have piling up debt. So we're all trying to work together to address these issues as a team, but the impact on the rest of our attorneys and practice areas here has obviously been significant. Yeah, and I encourage people, I mentioned the clinics before, so Katie and her team does a great job of maintaining a page that's on this slide to see where we may have, maybe it's a legal clinic, maybe it's a resource fair. You can always think about the potential of screening somebody for our services or telling them how to apply. So that's updated consistently, and we don't have to screen for eligibility and conflicts at those kind of events. So this is my last slide. So I just wanted to acknowledge that the North Carolina Department of Public Safety does have a private roads and bridges program. Unfortunately, the full repair application deadline passed a while ago, last August. at the end of February, will be the final deadline, and this is for the cost sharing one. So there's no downside to putting in an application for that. Somebody's waiting, like I hope FEMA pays for it. Great, apply for this also. Hazard mitigation program is the federal buyout program, or Elevate, put the house on stilts program. The first of those were approved just recently. That's a very long timeline that puts people in a real bind. Those go through the county application, and so that's still plugging along. Hopefully, I know the governor is making a real push to get the feds to approve those. We obviously have folks from long-term recovery groups on this call. Great resource there. Patchwork system of rental assistance from private sources, but sometimes there's help out there. You know, everyone, including PLS, but also the LTRGs, is working on trying to help people get estimates and appraisers and the kind of things that they need to tick the boxes for an insurance case or a FEMA case. And that's been a real struggle, and not because there aren't a lot of people out there, contractors doing wonderful work in the recovery process, but they're overwhelmed like the rest of us and like our clients. So that remains a work in progress, but we try to help people, our clients, try to access those resources as well.